October 14, 1944, Herrlingen, Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in his garden watching his 14-year-old son Manfred work on a model airplane. It was a peaceful Saturday morning, the kind of morning that felt impossible in the 5th year of a war Germany was losing. A black Mercedes turned onto the street. Rommel watched it approach. He knew what it meant. 2 generals stepped out, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel, both wearing the uniforms of Hitler's inner circle, both carrying the weight of a message Rommel had been expecting for weeks. Rommel's wife Lucy saw them from the window. Her face went pale. She knew too. Burgdorf's words were formal, almost ceremonial. Herr Feldmarschall, we bring you greetings from the Führer and an important communication. Rommel invited them inside, sent his wife and son away. What happened in the next 20 minutes would end with Germany's most celebrated general dead by his own hand, officially from injuries sustained in the July Allied air attack, actually from cyanide poisoning administered under duress. But Rommel hadn't plotted Hitler's assassination. He hadn't joined the July 20th conspiracy as an active participant. He hadn't committed treason in any traditional sense, such as betraying secrets to the enemy. His crime was simpler and, in Nazi Germany, far more dangerous. He'd told the truth about the war. He'd said out loud what everyone knew but no one dared speak. Germany was losing, the war was unwinnable, and continuing to fight would only destroy what remained of Germany. In Hitler's regime, honesty was treason. Speaking military reality was conspiracy. And Rommel, the Desert Fox, hero of North Africa, Germany's most famous general, had to die for the crime of being right. This is the story of how telling the truth became a capital offense, how a regime built on lies destroyed the man who refused to pretend, and how Rommel's betrayal of Hitler was actually the most profound loyalty to Germany, to reality, and to the millions of soldiers whose lives were being wasted in a war already lost. The hero, Rommel's rise. To understand why Rommel's death mattered so much, you need to understand what he represented to Germany. Erwin Rommel was Nazi Germany's most celebrated military commander. Not because he was the most senior, others outranked him, and not because he'd won the most battles, the Eastern Front generals had larger commands, but because he represented something the regime desperately needed, proof that German military genius could overcome material disadvantages. Rommel's fame came from North Africa, 1941 to 1943, the Africa Corps, the Desert War. With limited forces, inferior numbers, inadequate supplies, Rommel repeatedly defeated British forces. He used speed, deception, and tactical brilliance to compensate for material weakness. He earned British respect. They called him the Desert Fox, with a mixture of frustration and admiration. The Nazi propaganda machine loved Rommel. He was seen as apolitical, a professional soldier, though he had developed a close relationship with Hitler starting in the 1930s. This made him acceptable to conservative Germans skeptical of Nazi excesses. He was often portrayed as chivalrous. He treated many prisoners well and followed the laws of war in several instances, compared to the atrocities on the Eastern Front. However, units under his command did commit war crimes, including the murder of Jewish prisoners of war and the exploitation of Jewish civilians in Tunisia. This made his image more acceptable to international audiences, though the reality was more complex. He was photogenic, tall, lean, confident. The image of Rommel in goggles standing in a staff car became iconic. He won, or at least appeared to win, which was what mattered for propaganda. By 1942, Rommel was a field marshal at age 50, one of the youngest in the German army at the time. He was a national hero. His image appeared on recruiting posters, in newsreels, in propaganda films. Hitler trusted him, or appeared to. Rommel was given direct access to the Führer, bypassing normal chains of command. When Rommel asked for resources, Hitler listened. Rommel had first met Hitler in 1934 during a troop inspection and developed a close working relationship, including serving as commander of Hitler's personal bodyguard in 1939 and attending daily briefings. Early on, Rommel admired Hitler and supported his remilitarization plans. But this fame and access would become dangerous once Rommel started telling Hitler things the Führer didn't want to hear. The turning point, El Alamein and reality. October-November 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. Rommel's Afrika Korps faced British forces under Montgomery. The battle would determine control of North Africa and access to Middle Eastern oil. Rommel knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. British forces had numerical superiority, more tanks, better supplies, and complete air superiority. Rommel's supply lines across the Mediterranean were under constant attack. He lacked fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Rommel requested permission to retreat to more defensible positions, to preserve his forces for future operations rather than waste them in an unwinnable battle. Hitler's response was unambiguous: victory or death. No retreat. Fight to the last man. This was Hitler's standard order by late 1942. Stalingrad was happening simultaneously on the Eastern Front, another fight to the last man order that would destroy an entire German army. Rommel faced an impossible choice: obey orders and watch his army be destroyed, or disobey orders and be court-martialed for defying the Führer. He tried to obey. His forces fought brilliantly with what they had, but material reality cannot be overcome by willpower. Montgomery's superior forces ground down the Afrika Korps. By November 4th, Rommel had lost the battle. Rommel retreated anyway, disobeying Hitler's explicit order, though Hitler later retroactively approved it to avoid embarrassment. He saved what remained of his forces, but he'd crossed the line. He'd prioritized military reality over Hitler's orders. This was Rommel's first act of what the regime would later call defeatism. The pattern, speaking truth to power. After El Alamein, Rommel repeatedly told Hitler uncomfortable truths. Tunisia, May 1943. Rommel reported that Axis forces in North Africa couldn't hold out. They lacked supplies, reinforcements, and air support. He recommended evacuation to save trained troops for the defense of Europe. Hitler's response: fight to the last man. No evacuation. Result: over 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. An entire army lost. Soldiers who could have defended Italy or France. Italy? 1943, Rommel commanded forces in northern Italy. He reported that the mountainous terrain and limited resources made defending all of Italy impossible. He recommended withdrawing to defensible lines in the north. Hitler's response: hold every inch of Italian soil, no strategic withdrawals. Result: prolonged fighting in Italy that tied down German divisions needed elsewhere. France, 1944, Rommel commanded Atlantic Wall defenses. He inspected the fortifications and reported honestly, the Atlantic Wall was incomplete, undermanned, and couldn't stop a determined Allied invasion. Germany's only chance was mobile reserves that could counterattack quickly. But Germany lacked fuel for mobile warfare. Allied air superiority made daytime movements suicidal. The Luftwaffe couldn't contest Allied air dominance. Rommel's assessment: if the Allies established a beachhead, Germany couldn't push them back into the sea. The war in the West would be lost. Hitler's response: the Atlantic Wall is impregnable. German forces will throw the Allies back into the ocean. Each time Rommel delivered these assessments, He was speaking military reality. Each time, Hitler rejected that reality in favor of wishful thinking. And each time, Rommel's reputation within the regime eroded. He was becoming known as a defeatist, someone who didn't believe in German victory. In Nazi ideology, this was worse than military incompetence. Incompetence could be excused. Doubt in final victory was ideological treason. D-Day, the prophecy fulfilled. June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. Rommel's prophecy came true. The Atlantic Wall didn't stop them. Within hours, Allied forces were ashore. Within days, they'd established a beachhead that couldn't be eliminated. Rommel commanded German forces trying to contain the invasion. He fought skillfully with limited resources, but he also saw clearly what was happening. Germany was losing the war in the West. Allied material superiority was overwhelming. For every German tank, the Allies had 10. For every German aircraft, the Allies had 50. Allied artillery fired more shells in one day than German forces could fire in a week. And Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. Russia in the east, Italy in the south, France in the west. There weren't enough divisions, enough tanks, enough fuel, enough ammunition. Rommel began writing reports to Hitler that went beyond military assessments. They were strategic and political. The troops are fighting heroically, but the material balance is against us. We face an enemy with unlimited resources. We cannot win a war of attrition. The Western Front cannot be held indefinitely. We must consider political solutions before military collapse makes negotiation impossible. Continuing the war will only result in the destruction of Germany. We must seek an armistice with the Western Allies before the Soviets overrun Germany from the east. These reports were not what Hitler wanted to hear. They suggested the unthinkable, that Germany should surrender, or at least negotiate, before total defeat. In July 1944, Rommel sent his most explicit message on July 15th. It was a direct challenge to Hitler's leadership, sent through official channels. The situation in Normandy is deteriorating. Our troops are being ground down by superior Allied forces. I feel compelled to tell you clearly, the political and military situation demands that we end the war. The German people have suffered enough. Continuation will only bring more destruction. He never got a direct response. July 17th, 1944. The strafing. July 17th, 1944. Rommel was traveling by car from his headquarters near the Normandy front. Allied fighter aircraft spotted the vehicle and strafed it. Rommel suffered serious injuries, fractured skull, facial injuries, multiple contusions. He was incapacitated for weeks, sent home to Germany to recover. This removed him from command at the most critical moment, but it also saved his life, temporarily. Because 3 days later, on July 20th, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at his East Prussia headquarters. The plot failed. Hitler survived with minor injuries. The conspirators were rounded up and executed. And during interrogations, Rommel's name surfaced. The July 20th. Plot, guilt by association. Rommel was not an active participant in the July 20th assassination plot. He did not know the details of the bomb placement or have advance warning of the specific attempt. However, he was aware of broader conspiratorial discussions to remove Hitler from power and had been approached by plotters. The July 20th conspirators wanted to kill Hitler, establish a new government, and negotiate peace with the Western Allies. They believed this was the only way to save Germany from total destruction. Rommel agreed with that assessment. He'd said as much in his reports to Hitler. He believed the war was lost and that Germany needed to negotiate before Soviet armies occupied all of Germany. Where Rommel differed from the conspirators was on method. He opposed assassination. He believed Hitler should be arrested, brought before a German court, and tried for leading Germany to disaster. He wanted a legal change of government, not a bomb. But this distinction didn't matter to the Gestapo interrogators torturing the captured conspirators. Under torture, some conspirators mentioned Rommel. Not as an active plotter, they knew he'd refused to join the assassination, but as someone who shared their views about ending the war and had not reported the approaches. One conspirator, General Heinrich von Stolpnagel, mentioned that he'd discussed the possibility of a post-Hitler government with Rommel. Stolpnagel had approached Rommel about joining the conspiracy. Rommel had refused but hadn't reported the conversation to authorities. This was enough. Rommel knew about a plot against Hitler and hadn't reported it. In Nazi Germany's final year, this was treason. More importantly, Rommel's reports about the military situation, his defeatist assessments, were now reinterpreted as evidence of conspiracy. He wasn't just being realistic about military challenges. He was undermining German will to fight. He was supporting the goals of the conspirators. By August, the Gestapo had compiled a file on Rommel. The evidence was circumstantial: conversations, reports, associations. Nothing proved Rommel actively plotted against Hitler. But in Nazi Germany in summer 1944, proof wasn't necessary. Suspicion was enough. The regime's dilemma, the hero who couldn't be executed. Hitler and the Nazi leadership faced a problem. Rommel was too famous to simply execute. Most July 20th conspirators were arrested, tortured, and hanged. Their executions were filmed and shown to Hitler. It was brutal, public, and intended to terrorize anyone else who might consider defying the Führer. But Rommel was different. He was a national hero. His face appeared on propaganda posters. Soldiers worshipped him. The German public knew him as the Desert Fox, the brilliant general who'd fought honorably. Publicly executing Rommel would create a martyr. It would suggest that Germany's best generals were turning against Hitler. It would damage morale at a moment when the regime desperately needed the military and public to keep fighting. But Rommel couldn't be left alive either. He knew too much. He'd written too many reports about the hopeless military situation. If he survived the war, he'd be a powerful voice for the Germany was doomed by Hitler's incompetence narrative. The regime needed Rommel dead, but not publicly executed. Family. October 14th, 1944. The ultimatum. Back to October 14th, 1944. Herrlingen, Germany. The black Mercedes. Generals Bergdorf and Meisel entering Rommel's home. Bergdorf presented the evidence: Rommel's connections to July 20th conspirators, his defeatist reports, his failure to report knowledge of plots against the Führer. The conclusion: Rommel was implicated in the conspiracy against Hitler. He would be arrested and tried for treason. But there was an alternative. Bergdorf carried two letters. One was an arrest warrant, the other was a cyanide capsule. If Rommel took the cyanide, he would die immediately. His death would be announced as complications from his July injuries. He'd receive a state funeral with full military honors. His widow would receive a field marshal's pension. His son would be safe. His name and reputation would remain intact. If Rommel refused, he'd be arrested, tried by the People's Court, found guilty, and hanged. The trial would be public. His treason would be exposed. His family would be arrested and sent to concentration camps under Sippenhaft, Nazi practice of punishing entire families for individual crimes. His name would be disgraced, his reputation destroyed. Bergdorf gave Rommel 15 minutes to decide. Rommel asked to speak with his wife and son. Bergdorf refused. The decision was Rommel's alone. Rommel walked into his study. 15 minutes later, he emerged. He'd made his choice. He called his wife Lucy and son Manfred. He told them, "I'm going with these gentlemen. I'll be dead in 15 minutes. Hitler has ordered my execution. I can die by trial or I can die by my own hand. If I choose trial, you'll all be arrested. If I choose suicide, you'll be safe." Lucy collapsed. Manfred couldn't process what he was hearing. His father, the Field Marshal, the Desert Fox, the hero of Germany, was being murdered by his own government. Rommel put on his Afrika Korps leather jacket, the one from his desert campaigns, the one that symbolized his greatest victories. He embraced his wife and son. Then he walked to the Mercedes. Bergdorf and Meisel drove him to a secluded spot in the woods outside Herrlingen. Bergdorf handed Rommel the cyanide capsule. Rommel swallowed it. He died within minutes. The official announcement came hours later. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has died from complications of injuries sustained in an enemy air attack on July 17, 1944. The Führer deeply mourns the loss of one of Germany's greatest soldiers. Hitler sent a wreath. The state funeral was held on October 18th. Thousands attended. Rommel was buried with full military honors. The truth that Hitler had ordered his execution remained secret until after the war. The dark reason why Rommel had to die. So what was Rommel's actual crime? What had he done to deserve execution? He hadn't plotted assassination. He'd explicitly refused to join the July 20th conspiracy when approached. He hadn't committed treason. He'd never contacted the enemy, never revealed military secrets, never sabotaged operations. He hadn't even disobeyed orders in any significant way. Yes, he'd retreated from El Alamein against orders, but that was a tactical battlefield decision, not strategic defiance. Rommel's crime was simpler and more profound. He told the truth about the war. He wrote reports stating that Germany was losing, that Allied material superiority was overwhelming, that continuing the war would only destroy Germany, that political solutions should be pursued before military collapse made negotiation impossible. In any rational military system, this would be a commander's duty, provide honest assessments so political leaders can make informed decisions. But Nazi Germany wasn't rational. It was built on mythology. The mythology of German racial superiority, that German soldiers could overcome any material disadvantage through superior will and fighting spirit. The mythology of the Führer's genius, that Hitler's strategic instincts were infallible and questioning them was treason. The mythology of inevitable victory, that Germany would triumph because history, destiny, and providence demanded it. Rommel's honest military assessments challenged all these mythologies. He was saying, German soldiers are brave and skilled, but bravery cannot overcome 10-to-1 material disadvantages. Hitler's strategic decisions, no retreat, fight to the last man, deny reality, are destroying the German army. Germany will not win. Continuing to fight guarantees total defeat rather than negotiated settlement. This was intolerable. Not because it was wrong, everyone in the German high command knew it was true, but because admitting it publicly would destroy the regime's legitimacy. If Germany's most celebrated general was saying the war was lost, how could the regime demand millions of soldiers keep fighting? How could they demand civilians endure bombing, starvation, and hardship for a war already lost? The regime's power depended on maintaining the mythology of inevitable victory. Rommel threatened that mythology. Therefore, Rommel had to be eliminated. The dark reason Rommel betrayed Hitler was that he remained loyal to a more fundamental principle: reality itself. The alternative. Rommel never got to pursue. What would Rommel have done if he'd survived the war? His writings and conversations give us clues. Rommel wasn't planning a military coup. He opposed assassination, but he did want political change. His vision, based on his July 1944 memorandum and conversations with confidants: arrest Hitler and bring him before a German military court. Try him for war crimes, military incompetence, and leading Germany to disaster. Establish a military government led by senior generals who understood the military reality. Not a democracy immediately, Germany was in crisis, but a rational military leadership. Negotiate with the Western Allies for an armistice, offer to withdraw from occupied territories in exchange for reasonable peace terms. Emphasis on Western Allies. Rommel wanted to avoid Soviet occupation of Germany. Use remaining German military strength to defend Germany's eastern border against Soviet advances while negotiating with the West. Eventually transition to a new German government, probably constitutional monarchy or republic, after the crisis passed. This plan was naive in several ways. The Western Allies had committed to unconditional surrender. They wouldn't negotiate with any German government while war continued. The Soviets wouldn't accept being excluded from German occupation. The German military was too compromised by Nazi atrocities to establish legitimate alternative government. But the plan's naivety isn't the point. The point is what it reveals about Rommel's thinking. He wanted to end the war before Germany was completely destroyed. He prioritized Germany's survival over ideology, over Hitler's authority, over Nazi mythology. This was his treason, prioritizing German survival over regime loyalty. The cover-up, maintaining the myth. After Rommel's death, the Nazi regime worked hard to maintain the fiction that he died from injuries. State funeral, Hitler's public mourning, tributes to the great field marshal. His name continued to appear on propaganda as an example of German military excellence. The truth about his forced suicide was kept secret. Rommel's family knew but couldn't speak. The few officials involved in his death were sworn to secrecy. Why maintain the cover-up? Morale. If German soldiers learned that Hitler had ordered Rommel's execution, it would shatter morale. Rommel was beloved by troops. His death from injuries was tragic but honorable. His execution would be devastating. Propaganda. Rommel represented the clean Wehrmacht myth, that German military fought honorably even if the Nazi regime was criminal. Executing him would undermine that distinction. International image. Even in 1944, Nazi Germany cared somewhat about international perception. Executing a general for telling military truth would be bad propaganda. Preventing martyrdom. A publicly executed Rommel would become a martyr for the Germany was betrayed by Hitler narrative. Better to have him die heroically from war wounds. The cover-up worked. Most Germans didn't learn the truth until after the war. Many soldiers went to their deaths believing Rommel had died honorably from injuries. The post-war reckoning. Rommel's complicated legacy. After the war, Rommel's reputation became complicated and contested. The clean Rommel myth. Many Germans and some Western observers portrayed Rommel as the good German, a professional soldier who fought honorably, opposed Hitler eventually, and died because of his opposition. This narrative served post-war Germany's need for honorable military figures. The revisionist critique. Other historians pointed out that Rommel served Hitler faithfully for years. He benefited from the Nazi regime. His Afrika Korps committed war crimes, though fewer than forces on other fronts. His opposition came late and was driven by military pragmatism, not moral objection to Nazism. The nuanced assessment. Modern historians recognize that Rommel was neither pure hero nor pure villain. He was a brilliant tactical commander, politically naive or willfully blind to Nazi atrocities. Personally honorable in his military conduct in many cases, but complicit in overseeing units that committed crimes. Complicit in serving a criminal regime. Eventually willing to oppose Hitler, but only when military defeat was obvious. Killed for telling military truth, which was courage, even if belated. The most important question about Rommel isn't whether he was heroic or complicit. It's what his death reveals about totalitarian systems. In Nazi Germany, professional military competence wasn't enough. Military success wasn't enough. Even loyal service for years wasn't enough. What mattered was absolute ideological conformity, the willingness to deny reality when reality contradicted the regime's mythology. Rommel was killed because he wouldn't deny reality. That's simultaneously too little. He should have opposed Nazism earlier, and significant honesty cost him his life. The broader pattern, truth as treason. Rommel's execution was part of a broader pattern in Nazi Germany's final year. General Ludwig Beck, Chief of General Staff, who resigned in 1938 because he opposed Hitler's war plans, eventually joined the July 20th plot. Executed. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of military intelligence, who provided information to the resistance, executed in April 1945. General Henning von Tresckow repeatedly tried to assassinate Hitler. Committed suicide when the July plot failed. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, senior commander who joined July plot, hanged. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed the bomb on July 20th. Executed the same day. All of these men reached similar conclusions to Rommel. The war was lost. Hitler was destroying Germany. Something had to change. Some chose assassination, some chose passive resistance. Some, like Rommel, tried to work within the system while speaking truth. All were killed. The pattern is clear. In Nazi Germany's final phase, any form of reality-based assessment was treated as treason. The regime demanded absolute commitment to the mythology of victory, even as armies collapsed and cities burned. This wasn't just Hitler's personal paranoia. It was systemic. A totalitarian system built on lies cannot tolerate truth. Those who speak truth must be eliminated. Rommel's death exemplifies this perfectly. Germany's most famous general killed not for military failure but for military honesty. The counterfactual. If Rommel had lived. What if Rommel had survived the war? This is impossible to know, but we can speculate based on what happened to other senior German commanders. If Germany had won, impossible by October 1944, but hypothetically, Rommel would have been sidelined or eliminated anyway. His honest assessments and limited opposition to Hitler marked him as unreliable. The regime had no place for independent-minded generals. If the July plot had succeeded, Rommel might have played a role in a post-Hitler government. He had the prestige and respect to potentially lead military forces, but his political naivety would have been a liability in negotiating with allies. If he'd survived to war's end, several possibilities. Allied prosecution. Rommel commanded forces in North Africa and France. If evidence of war crimes emerged, he could have been tried at Nuremberg. Likely acquitted based on his relatively clean personal record, but the trial would have been humiliating. Post-war German leadership. Rommel had the prestige to potentially lead post-war German military or even political institutions, similar to how Adenauer led West Germany's reconstruction. Retirement. Most likely, Rommel would have retired from public life. His health was poor after July injuries. He might have written memoirs, lived quietly. But all of this assumes Rommel would have fundamentally changed. The man who served Hitler faithfully until mid-1944, who benefited from the regime, who looked away from Nazi crimes? Would that man have been a good post-war leader? Maybe. Some people do change. The Rommel of July 1944 who was willing to challenge Hitler was different from the Rommel of 1942 who obeyed without question. We'll never know. Hitler made sure of that. Lucy and Manfred, the family's burden. Rommel's wife Lucy and son Manfred lived with the burden of knowing their husband and father had been murdered by his own government. They couldn't speak publicly. Nazi officials watched them. Any suggestion that Rommel had been executed rather than dying from injuries would have resulted in arrest. Lucy received the field marshal's pension, blood money, for her silence. Manfred, 14 when his father died, grew up carrying the secret of how Rommel actually died. After the war, they finally told the truth. Manfred wrote books about his father. Lucy gave interviews. They described October 14, 1944, the black Mercedes, the ultimatum, the forced suicide. Their testimony was crucial to understanding what really happened. Without them, the Nazi cover story might have stood. Manfred became the mayor of Stuttgart and a respected political figure. He spent his life defending his father's reputation while also acknowledging his father's complicated relationship with Nazism. Lucy lived until 1971, always insisting that her husband had been murdered for telling the truth about the war. They both carried the burden of Rommel's legacy, neither pure hero nor pure villain, but a complex man who served evil and eventually opposed it and died for that opposition. The legacy, what Rommel's death means. 79 years after Rommel's forced suicide, what does his death tell us? About totalitarian systems, they cannot tolerate truth. When mythology is essential to power, reality becomes treason. Anyone who speaks uncomfortable truths must be eliminated. About military service, professional military competence is not apolitical. Serving an evil regime makes you complicit, even if you fight honorably. Rommel's tactical brilliance doesn't erase his service to Hitler. About moral courage, it's not enough to oppose evil when defeat is inevitable. True courage means opposing it when the cost is highest. Rommel's opposition came late, but it still cost him his life. About the banality of evil, Rommel wasn't killed by monsters. He was killed by bureaucratic process, generals delivering ultimatums, offering choices, maintaining procedural formality while committing murder. About historical complexity. People aren't simple heroes or villains. Rommel was a brilliant general who served evil, an honorable soldier who enabled atrocity, a man who eventually told the truth, but only when truth became unavoidable. The most important lesson: in systems built on lies, honesty is revolutionary. Speaking truth is resistance, and sometimes truth costs everything. Conclusion: the field marshal who wouldn't lie. October 14, 1944, a black Mercedes, two generals, an ultimatum disguised as a choice. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, hero of North Africa, Germany's most famous general, swallowed cyanide rather than face a show trial that would destroy his family. His crime? Telling the truth about the war. He'd written reports stating that Germany was losing, that Allied material superiority was overwhelming, that continuing to fight would only destroy what remained of Germany, that political solutions should be pursued before military collapse. In Nazi Germany, this was treason. Not legal treason. Rommel had committed no actual crimes, but ideological treason, betraying the mythology that Germany would inevitably triumph. The regime couldn't tolerate a famous general saying the war was lost. It would shatter the mythology essential to maintaining power. It would validate the July 20th conspirators' assessment that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. So Rommel had to die, not publicly, that would create a martyr, but quietly with honor maintained, with cover story intact. The dark reason Rommel betrayed Hitler wasn't conspiracy or disloyalty. It was loyalty to a more fundamental principle, reality itself. He remained loyal to Germany, to the millions of soldiers whose lives were being wasted, to the truth that continuation meant total destruction. In a regime built on lies, loyalty to truth was unforgivable. Rommel chose truth over mythology. It cost him his life. But his death exposed the essential nature of totalitarian systems. They demand absolute conformity to lies. They punish honesty more severely than incompetence. They fear truth more than external enemies. Rommel was neither pure hero nor pure villain. He served evil faithfully until it became impossible to deny that evil was destroying Germany. His opposition came late. His courage emerged only when alternatives disappeared. But when he finally opposed, when he finally spoke truth, the regime killed him for it. That's the dark reason Rommel had to die. In Nazi Germany, admitting defeat was enough to earn a death sentence. And the darkest truth, Rommel was right. Everything he said about the war was accurate. Germany was losing. Continuation meant total destruction. The war should have ended. Hitler knew it. The Nazi leadership knew it. Everyone knew it. But they killed the man who said it out loud. Because in a regime built on lies, the truth is the most dangerous weapon of all.